Hello! Today, we're going to look at my favorite way of cashing out an epistemological moral argument for God's existence. There are some moral arguments that are based on the nature of morality, like arguments that try to ground morality in God's nature, or try to show that divine command theory is the best theory of morality on the table. This argument isn't like that. We're not arguing from the nature of morality, but from our knowledge of moral facts. That being said, this argument is going to rest on some assumptions about the nature of morality. Most notably, that there are true moral facts. So some statements like, you have an obligation to not torture people for fun, are true. Now some people, called moral nihilists, think that these statements are false. Others, called non-cognitivists, don't think that these are true or false. Moral statements just express something like approval and disapproval, rather than external features of the world. But a premise of this argument is that these views are wrong, and there are true moral facts. The defense of this premise is that it's highly intuitive. There are, of course, lots of other defenses of this premise, but we're not going to be getting into those here, since I've defended such usage of intuition previously in the series. If you don't share such intuitions, then this argument just isn't directed at you. Another premise about the nature of morality is that the moral facts are not influenced by our beliefs. So, torturing infants for fun is wrong, but not because people believe it's wrong. Morality is not informed by the beliefs of creatures or anything like that. While I think this premise is intuitive, I actually think this argument can be run without this premise, but that discussion gets complicated and goes beyond the scope of this video. The next premise is that we know what the moral facts are. If you accept the existence of moral facts on the basis of your intuitions, then you probably accept this premise as well for similar reasons. So this argument is directed at naturalists who believe there are these moral facts, and we have these beliefs that match up with the moral facts. Let's call this matchup between the moral facts and our moral beliefs moral knowledge. How probable is the existence of moral knowledge given theism and given naturalism? The probability of this matchup given theism would be very high. It's good for creatures to know the moral facts because this knowledge is quite valuable, and it's important to living morally, which is itself good. The mechanism by which theism ensures our moral knowledge is also very clear. God knows the moral facts because he's omniscient, and he's powerful enough to ensure that we possess an understanding of morality. Now, what mechanism is there to ensure a matchup between the moral facts and our beliefs given naturalism? Well, here's one account. Evolution is geared towards giving us moral knowledge because moral knowledge improves the fitness of our species. As a concrete example, let's use the golden rule. It's a true moral fact that you should treat other people the way you want to be treated. Now, if organisms believe this, they will help members of their own species survive, and so their species will be better at surviving overall. So evolution selects for true beliefs about morality. Coolio. Now, there's something fishy about this reasoning. Specifically, because morality doesn't do anything. Ever. For example, let's say that Alice sees that Bob is hurt, and she decides to help him and be a good Samaritan because she believes in the golden rule. Now, if we analyze everything that happened in this scenario, morality didn't actually affect anything. Her belief in the golden rule caused her to carry out her actions. But it's not like the golden rule itself made her carry out this action. Morality doesn't causally affect things. Only our beliefs about it do. Now, why is this a problem for naturalists? Dustin Crummett has a good analogy that illustrates the problem. Imagine you had a race of mischievous goblins. They don't have any sense of morality. However, they are born with the unshakable belief that there's an undetectable deity that has never done anything at all. It has made no impact on the course of history whatsoever. It hasn't created or affected anything. Furthermore, on some future judgment day, this deity will punish all goblins, proportionally to how much they have harmed other goblins. Now, goblin scientists figured out that this belief, in all likelihood, has evolved because it's the only thing making a functioning society possible amongst such a mischievous species. Without this belief, they'd be constantly pranking and stealing from each other, and generally harming their species' chances at survival. But with that belief, they can live in groups and have social interaction and stuff. Now, it seems that the belief of these goblins in this deity is problematic. By the very nature of their hypothesis, where the deity has never done anything, they have zero evidence for the deity's existence. They just believe in it because they have an evolutionarily driven predisposition to believing in this non-causal entity. But the process that produced this belief isn't truth tracking. Even if there really was such an invisible goblin judgment deity, its existence is not what drove evolution to instill belief in it in goblin kind. Their belief in the deity is not related to the existence of the entity in question. Likewise, for the naturalist who believes in the existence of moral facts, it seems that this belief would have the same status as the goblin's belief in a deity. Even if it was true, it would only be true as a matter of luck, because the evolutionary process that brought... Now, this thought experiment indicates that there is a problem for naturalist moral realists, but it doesn't tell us where the problem is, nor how to formulate this argument in a Bayesian framework. I think there are two ways of pinpointing the precise problem for the naturalist. Let's go back to the goblin analogy for a second. The idea is that the goblins can say, hey, even if our deity did exist, we'd need to be really lucky to evolve in exactly the right way to believe in it, rather than some other set of survival-helping beliefs. But another thing they could say is, okay, evolution gave us these beliefs, but we need to be really lucky for the exact sort of invisible deity to be the goblin judgment deity out of any possible invisible deity. So they can say, given the existence of our exact deity, our particular evolutionary history would be improbable, or they could say, given the existence of our particular evolutionary history, our exact deity would be improbable. These two arguments get at the same underlying truth. If there was a matchup between their beliefs and the existence of such an invisible deity, they'd be incredibly lucky. Analogously, there are two arguments concluding that the matchup between the moral facts and our beliefs about them is improbable given naturalism. Firstly, it's improbable that evolution would produce moral intuitions that line up with the moral facts. Secondly, it's improbable that the moral facts would line up with the moral intuitions that evolution gave us. We'll look at how these separate arguments interact soon enough. But first, let's look at the first argument in more depth. If there are ways that intelligent creatures could evolve that did not require, say, knowing the golden rule, but would nonetheless help each other survive, then suddenly moral knowledge depends on an element of luck. We need to be lucky enough to get the exact evolutionary history that yields moral knowledge, as opposed to some other evolutionary history that still works, but without knowing morality. So the question becomes, are there such possible alternative evolutionary histories? Well, yes. I just mentioned one example with the goblin thought experiment. That hypothetical species did not have moral knowledge, but was still incentivized to help other members of its species survive. Here's another idea. A premise of this argument is that non-cognitivism is false, but evolution could have produced creatures with an incorrect non-cognitive understanding of morality. So they would act in accordance with the golden rule, but they nonetheless don't recognize the golden rule as a true fact, so they lack moral knowledge. Or what if insect-like creatures evolved human-level intelligence, where one queen was served by many drones, and it was better for them to believe that morality was all about prioritizing the queen's desires over everything else, instead of believing the golden rule? With a little imagination, it quickly becomes apparent that evolution did not need to impart moral knowledge to us in order for us to thrive as a species. It had other options. We just got lucky, given naturalism. Now, the second argument is a lot more exotic. I want you to imagine a guy named Jim. He thinks that morality is all about paperclips. Creating paperclips is morally good, and destroying them is morally bad. Morality doesn't have anything else to say. Torturing babies for fun isn't morally bad. He doesn't believe in the golden rule, just the paperclip rule. Now, obviously, Jim is wrong, but his theory of morality is internally consistent. It's not logically contradictory or anything. We just know that it's false because it clashes with our moral intuitions. So even though we know it's wrong, it's logically possible in a broad sense. Now let's consider all logically possible moral theories. There are a ton. Moral theories about hopping on one foot, about wearing blue hats on Wednesdays, and so on. Infinitely many. Now, we know that the vast majority of these are wrong due to our moral intuitions. But I submit to you that these moral intuitions are information and should be treated the same way we treat any other information. We can update on it with Bayesian reasoning. All these logically possible moral theories would get the same prior probability by the principle of indifference. And then we update our credences with our moral intuitions. This ends up raising the probability of theism. To illustrate how that would work, imagine a hypothetical scenario where Jim learns that his moral intuitions are all messed up by some problem with his brain. But a wizard is going to heal him by magically giving him knowledge of the true moral facts. Prior to the procedure, Jim reasons, hey, if theism is true, God would want creatures to know the moral facts. So I would expect him to set up the universe to produce creatures that knew the moral facts. So I would suspect I'm about to learn that morality is what all these other humans have been saying the whole time, golden rule and all that. But if naturalism is true, I have no idea what to expect. It could match up with the set of facts that humans evolved to believe, but maybe it's something else entirely. Maybe it's about hopping on one foot or whatever. It's not like evolution would have played out any differently if that's the true moral theory. So if humans are generally correct about the moral facts, they're super lucky, given naturalism. Then, Jim learns that the golden rule and stuff is the true moral theory, and he becomes a lot more confident in theism rather than naturalism. The argument is that we should react to our own moral intuitions the same way Jim reacts to the wizard's procedure, and we should become more confident in theism. It doesn't matter when you get your information according to Bayesianism. Whenever we learn that the moral facts line up with our beliefs about them, we should react the same way, whether we're born with a trustworthy and innate understanding of the moral facts, or whether we're given such an understanding by a wizard. Now, track with me here. In that scenario, the wizard's magic is just assumed to be accurate. But do we get to assume our moral beliefs are accurate? Because if we were in a world where the moral facts are completely different from our beliefs about them, we would have no way of knowing that. If Jim's paperclip moral theory was true, for example, but we all believed in the golden rule and stuff, we would have no way of accessing the non-causal moral facts and correcting our beliefs. However, this scenario is a skeptical scenario, and can therefore be ruled out in whatever fashion you usually rule out skeptical scenarios. Here's the deal. We get to presume that the faculties of our mind are basically reliable. We get to presume that our sense data is basically reliable, our memory is basically reliable, and so on. Part of that package is that we get to presume that our moral intuitions are basically reliable. To put it another way, we get to conclude that our moral intuitions line up with the moral facts, just in the same way that we get to conclude that when our senses tell us that trees exist, that lines up with the existence of real trees. We can discard the possibility that our moral intuitions are wrong in the same way that we could discard skeptical scenarios like trees not exist but we're in the Matrix or something like that. How exactly this is done varies from epistemology to epistemology, but everyone has some way of ruling out skeptical scenarios like this. Unless you're actually a global skeptic, in which case you're not going to be convinced by any arguments ever anyways. Okay, now that we're off that tangent, we can conclude that we should reason the same way Jim does in that thought experiment, and we should raise our credence in theism. Now, we have two arguments. How do they interact? Well, I'm going to draw a square to represent the probability space. For the moment, we're going to let this entire square represent the naturalism side of the probability space. The structure of the first argument is that there are a lot of different ways we could evolve, and only one way of evolving would end up matching the moral facts. The other argument is that there are a lot of different logically possible moral theories, and only one of them ends up lining with the moral beliefs we evolved to have. Combining these, we get a matrix where columns represent the different possible moral theories, and rows represent the different possible moral beliefs we could evolve. Now, moral knowledge occurs when the moral beliefs match up with the moral theory. Let's say M1 corresponds to the moral facts in our world, and B1 represents the evolutionary history leading to the moral beliefs in our world. These correspond, so we get moral knowledge. Now, let's say M2 represents a different moral theory, one where the moral facts are actually about fulfilling the desires of a species' queen, and B2 represents the evolutionary history leading to the moral beliefs in a world with insectoid creatures. Well, there's moral knowledge here, but no moral knowledge anywhere else. This starts creating a diagonal, but the diagonal doesn't go on forever. There are some ways of evolving that make moral knowledge impossible. If we evolved in such a way that we were those goblin things, then no matter what moral theory was true, moral knowledge would be impossible because goblins don't have any moral beliefs. Furthermore, there are many moral theories that just can't plausibly be evolved towards. Like, if that paperclip moral theory was true, then there doesn't seem to be a viable evolutionary history that would lead to organisms knowing it. So, this matrix illustrates that the only subsection of the probability space where moral knowledge occurs is this little diagonal line that doesn't even go across the whole square. That is to say, moral knowledge is very improbable given naturalism. Now, let's draw up a more representative probability space for this argument. We have the theism side and the naturalism side. And remember how I had some premises about the nature of morality? While plausible, you are probably not absolutely certain that they're true. So we'll divide the probability space thusly. Above this line, morality has the right nature needed for this argument to work. Below this line, morality is something else. Non-cognitivism or relativism or something. Now, in the naturalism side of the probability space, we have this little diagonal line representing the occurrence of moral knowledge. On the theism side of the probability space, God would ensure moral knowledge, unless the moral theory is something weird like it is immoral to bring about creatures that have moral knowledge. So moral knowledge is going to be a lot more common on the theism side of the probability space. So when we update on the existence of moral knowledge, much more of the naturalism side of the probability space gets scribbled out. When we stretch back to a square, you could probably see that the bottleneck for this argument's strength ends up being how certain we were about the nature of morality. If there was a 100% chance that there were true moral facts independent of what we believed about them, and yet we did in fact know them, this argument would be insanely strong. But an argument is only as strong as its weakest premise. So, what score do I give this argument? I am personally quite convinced that morality does have those properties, so I'd give it a fairly strong score at about 30. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.